and to hand it over to you, Jonathan. Thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. All right, I will share my screen here. Just waiting for the PowerPoint to start up. All right. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here, and I appreciate your patience last week with the technology. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to give you a brief introduction to reading Old Testament poetry. So I'd like to start by mentioning a few resources that you might find helpful if you find the information that I talk about today interesting and you want to read about it further. So the first resource I'll mention is an article by Adele Berlin called Reading Biblical Poetry. It's found in the Jewish Study Bible. And this is a wonderful, brief, and accessible article that is really helpful. So I would highly recommend it. A number of the aspects of my presentation today are based on Professor Berlin's article. So I just want to express my gratitude to her scholarship. A second resource I'd like to mention and highly recommend is The Art of Biblical Poetry, a great book by Robert Alter. Alter's a professor emeritus of comparative literature at UC Berkeley. He also has a volume which actually came out first called The Art of Biblical Narrative. Both of these volumes are really wonderful descriptions of what's going on in terms of the Bible's literature. And like I said, I'd highly recommend this. Very accessible, written for the layperson, but trenchant and poignant analysis. So wonderful book. The third resource I'd like to mention is The Great Poems of the Bible, which is written by James Kugel, who, in addition to Adele Berlin and Robert Alter, is one of the foremost scholars of Hebrew poetry. And this volume, Kugel has some translations of well-known poems from the Old Testament, and he has some commentary. So if you want to dig into the primary source material and have some commentary, this is a good volume to check out. One final resource I'd like to mention is a book called Classical Hebrew Poetry, A Guide to Its Techniques by Wilfred Watson. This is more of a technical volume. It assumes a knowledge of Hebrew, though you can certainly gain from it if you don't know Hebrew. But if you're really interested in some of the rhetorical devices that I discussed today, or some of the categories that I mentioned, and you want to dig deeper, you could look at this book if you really want to get into the weeds. But the first three books that I mentioned, well, the article and the other two books, those are definitely more accessible than this one. One final note, and I guess maybe just because I'm an editor by profession that I have to mention something like this, but all the Bible translations in this presentation are taken from the NRSV unless otherwise noted. So I basically want to divide the time today into two sets of remarks. The first, I want to talk about what parts of the Old Testament are poetry. And then the second section is the hallmarks of Hebrew poetry. And that's going to take the majority of our time. But first, I just want to look at what parts of the Old Testament are written in poetry. About 1/3 of the Old Testament is poetry. And if you factor in the New Testament, then that adds up to about 1/4 of the Christian Bible being poetry. And so I've listed here the 4 divisions of the canon according to the traditional Jewish conception of the canon, which is a little different from the Protestant conception of the canon in particular. So if these categories here, Torah, former prophets, latter prophets, and writings, look a little unfamiliar to you, that's because it's the Jewish divisions of the canon. And I'll explain in a minute which biblical books fall into each category. But first, just a very brief overview. So the Torah, the Pentateuch, there's a little bit of poetry. And I'll flesh all this out again in a minute. The former prophets, there's a little bit of poetry. The latter prophets are mostly poetry. In the writings, it's about half and half. By contrast with the Old Testament, very little of the New Testament is written in poetry. A few notable examples I've listed here: Mary's Magnificat in Luke 1, which isn't the whole chapter, of course, but it's found in Luke 1. Then in the next chapter, in Luke 2, Simeon gives a speech in the temple about boy Jesus, the baby Jesus. That's a poem. Then there's a few short passages in the epistles, such as Philippians 2, that was partly written in poetry, and a few short passages in the book of Revelation are poetry. But by and large, as you know, there's not a lot of poetry in the New Testament. Here's a little food for thought. I'm just going to throw these questions out there, but not answer them. What does it say about God that 1/3 of the Old Testament, that is about a quarter of the Christian Bible as a whole, is written in the form of poetry? A related question, which is not directly relevant to this class: what does it say about God that much of the rest of the Old Testament and the New Testament is written in the form of stories? Now I'd like to look in a little more detail about at what I mentioned before, namely where poetry occurs in the different divisions of the Hebrew Bible canon. So the Torah is also known as the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of Moses. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So the Torah mostly consists of prose narratives, but significant poems appear at important junctures in the narrative. So toward the end of Genesis, you get the testament of Jacob, where he gives the blessings on his sons. And then in Exodus 15, you get the Song of the Sea, which is a poetic celebration or description of the crossing of the Red Sea. So it's another important narrative development. So testament of Jacob, the family nation of Israel is about to go down into Egypt and start dwelling there. And then the Song of the Sea, they've just crossed the Red Sea. And then another important narrative juncture in the Pentateuch is when the Israelites are about to cross into the Promised Land. So at the end of the wilderness wanderings, you get the oracles of Balaam, and that's in Numbers 23 and 24. And then basically most of the book of Deuteronomy consists of laws. And so then at the end of Deuteronomy, the Israelites are still poised on the edge of the Promised Land. And you get a couple important poems there: the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 and the Testament of Moses in Deuteronomy 33. So anyway, there's some interesting reasons why these poems appear here at these significant junctures in the narrative that I'm not going to talk about today. But it is pretty interesting. In addition, there are some very short poems that occur here and there, or fragments of poems, such as in Genesis 4, Lamech's poem where he says Cain was avenged 7 times, Lamech will be avenged 77 times. We'll actually look at that verse a little bit later today. And then spring up, oh well, that kind of phrase that may be familiar to you from singing praise songs, for example. That's actually from Numbers 21. It's just a tiny kind of isolated fragment of a poem. But again, on the whole, in the Torah, there's not a lot of poetry. Let's talk now about the next division in the canon, which is the former prophets. The former prophets consist of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings. So they're narrative books. So not surprisingly, since they're narrative books, like the Torah, the former prophets mostly consist of prose narratives. But again, significant poems appear at important junctures. So whoever was responsible for structuring at least the final form of the Pentateuch and the former prophets thought it was helpful to put these poems in certain places. So in Judges 5, you get the Song of Deborah, which is celebrating the defeat of Sisera and his army. 1 Samuel 2, so this is the beginning of the life of Samuel. You get the prayer of Hannah, his mother. Then 2 Samuel 1, you get David's elegy over Saul and Jonathan. So this is the end of Saul and Jonathan's life. So another pivotal moment in the narrative. And then at 2 Samuel 22, you get David's song, which is a poetic reflection at the end of his life. So again, you get these poems at significant junctures during the period of the Judges, beginning of Samuel's life, end of Saul and Jonathan's life, and end of David's life. Like the Torah, in the former prophets, there's occasionally a short poem or fragment of a poem. So if you think of Solomon's dedication speech, and when he's dedicating the temple in 1 Kings 8, at the beginning of that, there's his prayer, there's a little kind of poetic fragment there. Let's move now to the latter prophets, which is the third of the 4 divisions of the canon of the Old Testament. So this consists of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. So the books that we would traditionally consider to be the prophets, but in the Jewish canon, they're called the latter prophets, whereas the narratives that precede them are called the former prophets. So in contrast to the Torah and the former prophets, the latter prophets consist mostly of poetry, with occasional prose narratives interspersed. So the following compositions are poetry. Most of the speeches in Isaiah, most of the speeches in Jeremiah, and most of the speeches in Ezekiel. And notice that I've said the speeches, not most of these books, because there are narratives in these books as well. Most of the chapters in the 12 minor prophets are poetry, with some notable exceptions. So the following are prose. Most of Jonah is prose, most of Zechariah is prose, all of Haggai is prose, and nearly all of Malachi is prose. So poetry is the most concentrated in the latter prophets. Here's another item of food for thought. Why might poetry have been considered the most suitable vehicle for most of the messages or speeches of the Old Testament prophets? Let's now move to the final of the 4 divisions of the Hebrew canon, namely the writings. And this one may be the most unfamiliar in terms of category if you're used to the Christian order of books. It's a bit of a grab bag of books in terms of genre. So the books that fall into this category for writings are Psalms, Proverbs, Job, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So the writings, being a more miscellaneous collection of books than the Torah, former prophets, or the latter prophets, are perhaps not surprisingly a mixture of poetry and prose. In the writings, poetry is found primarily in the following: Psalms, the whole book is poetry. Job, almost the whole book's poetry, the whole book except for the prologue and epilogue, which are in prose. Proverbs, the whole book's poetry. Song of Songs, the whole book's poetry. Lamentations, the whole book is poetry. And Ecclesiastes, about a 1/6 of the book is poetry. So there's a lot of poetry in the writings, but as you can see, if you look at the list of books at the top of the screen, like Ezra, Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ruth, Esther, those books are basically prose, or mostly prose, with a few poems here and there. So again, it's about half and half poetry and prose in the writings. So that concludes the first of the 2 parts of what I'm going to talk about today. So we talked about what parts of the Old Testament are poetry. That's just a brief overview. And so for the rest of our time together, I'd like to talk about the hallmarks, or main characteristics, of Hebrew poetry. But first, let's just take a step back for a moment, and I want to ask the question, why should we learn about the features of Hebrew poetry? Why is this important or interesting? Many of the Bible's poetic passages may be very familiar to us. We may read them over and over for years, and we may feel confident we know what they mean. So why might it be helpful to classify and analyze the poetic techniques they contain, which is what we're going to spend the rest of our time doing? Well, my basic answer to this question would be that doing this allows us to slow down as we read, which in turn helps us to understand the text better, see nuances we might have missed, and internalize the text more profoundly. So effectively, doing what we're doing today is like the study of any literature. It's just, it enables you to do close reading, which has a lot of benefits. So I'm just trying to help us as we continue to read the Old Testament to just pay closer attention and to benefit from that and enjoy doing so. Here's a nice quotation from Robert Alter that summarizes, I think, what I was just trying to say, but in a much more articulate way. So Robert Alter said, "Poetry is quintessentially the mode of expression in which the surface is the depth, so that through careful scrutiny of the configurations of the surface, the articulation of the line, the movement from line to poem, the imagery, the arabesques of syntax and grammar, the design of the poem as a whole, we come to apprehend more fully the depth of the poem's meaning." So with poetry, the medium is the message to a certain degree. So studying the medium is important for understanding the message. Let's look now at the hallmarks of Hebrew poetry. And I think you could basically boil this down to 6 main characteristics. The first hallmark of Hebrew poetry is elevated discourse with respect to subject matter, vocabulary, and style. Here I'm just giving an overview again, and then I'll flesh these out for the rest of our time together. The second hallmark of Hebrew poetry is that it contains imagery, simile, metaphor, and I've thrown personification in here. Even technically, it might not be classified as imagery per se, but it's related. The third hallmark of Hebrew poetry is a little bit of a catch-all category of various rhetorical devices, such as irony, oxymoron, hyperbole, ellipsis, or gapping, which refers to, like, you have a verb in one line of poetry, and then the next line, like, the verb is omitted, it's implied, for example. Acrostics occur, allusion, use of rare words, etc. These are just some examples of the many rhetorical devices you come across in poetry. The fourth characteristic or hallmark of Hebrew poetry is concision. Lines are terse, poems are short. The fifth hallmark of Hebrew poetry, maybe, is meter. So I've thrown in a bunch of question marks here. It's basically debated whether Hebrew poetry has meter. I think the short answer is it probably doesn't, or at least it's not nearly as consistent as it is in other poetries. But we'll talk about this a little bit briefly later, but thought at least need to mention it as a possibility. The sixth and final characteristic of Hebrew poetry is parallelism, which is probably its main or most salient characteristic. And parallelism basically refers to the similarity or equivalence of adjacent poetic lines. So if you look at these 6 characteristics, the first 4 of them, elevated discourse, imagery, various rhetorical devices, and concision, are common to the poetries of most cultures. So just think of poems that you love in English or another language. You can easily think of aspects of those poems that relate to these categories. Hallmark number 5, meter, is a feature of much, but by no means all, poetry from around the world and throughout history. So if you think of free verse, for example, there's not meter, or at least not consistent meter there, such as you find in a lot of poetry. Like if you think of Shakespeare or iambic pentameter, for example, it's a pretty strict bounds to the metrical units. And then finally, parallelism, feature 6, is characteristic of, though not unique to, the poetry of ancient Israel and its neighbors. A little while ago, I was reading something called the Kalevala, which is a Scandinavian myth, and it's highly parallelistic, which I thought was interesting, and I'd like to learn more about it. I don't know if anybody listening today has studied it, but it made me wonder to what degree is that indebted to the Hebrew Bible, if at all. It does seem to have some allusions, but anyway, it'd be interesting to look to see where else in world poetry parallelism occurs. But it's definitely a characteristic of ancient Israel and its neighbors. For example, Ugaritic poetry is highly parallelistic. And interestingly, parallelism comes through rather clearly in translation, which is wonderful because it means that the main or most salient feature of Hebrew poetry is relatively clear even in translation, so in English or translation into any other language. So we can grasp basically what's going on, even with a lot of the nuances of the poetry of the Old Testament, even in translation, which is a wonderful thing. So now I'd like to proceed to look through and discuss each of these 6 hallmarks of Hebrew poetry in a little more detail. So first, I'd like to discuss elevated discourse. So Hebrew poetry, like the poetry of many cultures, has elevated subject matter. So what's some of the subject matter we come across in the Old Testament? Psalms, there are psalms, hymns, prayers, instructions, such as we find in Proverbs, lament, theodicy, prophecy, and love poetry. So these are important topics. They're not just mundane, quotidian, everyday life topics. To some degree, nearly all literature can be described as elevated discourse. So neither prose nor poetry represents everyday speech, but this is especially true of poetry. Poetry is further removed in general from the way we talk in our everyday speech than prose is. Let's look at just a couple examples of elevated vocabulary and style that we find in Hebrew poetry. And there's a couple interesting cases where you get a prose account in the Old Testament, and then it's followed immediately by a poetic version of the same event. So the 2 most well-known examples of this are in Exodus 14 and 15, where you have the crossing of the Red Sea, and then in Judges 4 and 5, where you have the battle against Sisera. So in Exodus 14 and 15, 14 is the prose account of the crossing of the Red Sea, 15 is the poetic version. So here's a verse from chapter 14 that is describing part of what's going on. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. So a very powerful event is being described, but the way it's described is somewhat prosaic. The equivalent verse in chapter 15, the poetic version, is this: at the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up, the flood stood up in a heap, the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. So you have this imagery of God breathing out from his nostrils as the wind to blow the water back, and then you have another image, the heart of the sea. And then in terms of vocabulary, the waters and the floods, that's not particularly highfalutin vocabulary, but then the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The word congealed is not a typical word in Hebrew, well, in the Hebrew Bible, just as it's not a prosaic word in English. So it's just interesting to look at the differences between the prose version of this and the poetic version. Now let's look briefly at Judges 4 and 5, which is the next pair of prose and poetic versions of the same account. So in Judges 4, part of that, verse 19 and 21, it says, then this is Sisera, so it goes into Yael's tent. It says, then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty. So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. But Yael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand and went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Now let's look at that, the description of this event in the next chapter, Judges 5. He asked water, and she gave him milk. She brought him curds in a lordly bowl. She put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet. She struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. So you can see here a number of the hallmarks of poetry that I noted earlier, and I'm not going to discuss all of them, but I just highlighted in green here some of the sophisticated or unusual vocabulary. So milk is referred to in, well, it's referred to as milk in the first line here, but then the second line in parallel is referred to as curds. And then the skin of milk is referred to as a lordly bowl. And then a tent peg is referred to as a workman's mallet. So sophisticated vocabulary, unusual vocabulary. And then finally, with regard to elevated vocabulary style, I just want to point out that the book of Job, which is arguably the Bible's most exquisite and masterful poem, or more precisely, it's a collection of poems. We'll talk about that a little bit later. It's not just one long poem. Anyway, the book of Job is filled with rare words, foreign words, archaisms, and the like. And for that reason, Job is generally considered to be one of the hardest compositions to read in Hebrew, or perhaps in English for that matter. Okay, well now let's move on to the next hallmark of Hebrew poetry, which is imagery. So here's an example of imagery from the first chapter of Joel, verses 6 to 7. For a nation has invaded my land, powerful and innumerable. Its teeth are lion's teeth, and it has the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vines and splintered my fig trees. It has stripped off their bark and thrown it down. Their branches have turned white. So the term that I've highlighted in blue here, a nation, is what's being described. It's not totally clear what actually is being described here. Is it a human army, a locust army? But anyway, it's an army or a people or a nation. But what's not being described here literally is lions. But you get this image of lions to describe the nation, the army. And so they have lion's teeth, the fangs of a lioness. They've laid waste the vines. They're chewing everything up and destroying everything and throwing it to the ground. So this imagery is a really powerful way of describing what is going on with the army. It's a concrete way. Another example of imagery is here in Job 6, 2-3. Oh, that my vexation were weighed, Job says, and all my calamity laid in the balances. For then it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words have been rash. So if you look at the words in blue, what Job is talking about is his vexation and his calamity. But he uses the image of them being weighed in a scale or a balance and being heavier than the sand of the sea, which is very rich imagery. It's a great way of describing how intense his suffering is, how weighty his vexation and calamity are. Under the category of imagery fall simile and metaphor. And so with both simile and metaphor, thing A is compared to thing B with respect to thing C. And the thing C here is, people refer to that as the ground of comparison, which basically means you're saying thing A is like thing B in some way. And with both simile and metaphor, the way in which the things are similar is often not stated. So you have to infer it, which makes you think about it. And for that reason, simile and metaphor can be powerful literary devices because they cause you to slow down and think, how are thing A and thing B like each other? So in simile, a similitude is drawn between thing A and thing B with a connecting word such as like or as. An example from Psalm 103 here: as for mortals, their days are like grass. They flourish like a flower of the field. So in this verse, mortals and their days are said to be like grass and flowers with respect to being short-lived. So you have to infer that they're similar with respect to being short-lived. It doesn't say how they're similar. It just says that they are. Job 24:24 says, they, that is the wicked, are exalted a little while and then are gone. They wither and fade like the mallow. They are cut off like the heads of grain. So here the wicked are like the mallow and grain with respect to withering and fading and being cut off. And actually here the ground of comparison is explicit. It says exactly how the wicked are like mallow and heads of grain. A couple other examples of simile: Proverbs 2:4, if you seek it, that is wisdom, like silver, and search for it as hidden treasures. So here, how is wisdom like silver and hidden treasures? It's like them with respect to being precious. So the simile is a powerful way of describing wisdom because it likens wisdom to something else which is concrete, and also it forces you to think about how wisdom is like those things. A final example of simile, Isaiah 1:8, and daughter Zion is left like a booth in a vineyard, like a shelter in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Zion is like a booth here, a shelter in a besieged city with respect to being exposed and vulnerable. Metaphor is very much like simile. The main difference is that the connecting word like or as that indicates the similitude is not present. So example of metaphor, Job 29:15, I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. So this verse says that Job was like eyes with respect to seeing and like feet with respect to walking. So again, you have to slow down and say, how was Job like eyes and how was he like feet? Jeremiah 2:14 has metaphor. Is Israel a slave? Is he a homeborn servant? Why then has he become prey? So here Israel is like a slave, a servant, and prey with respect to being vulnerable. I'll mention one more example of metaphor from Micah 3. So it's talking about the leaders of Israel. You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people and the flesh off their bones, who eat the flesh off my people, or eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin off them, break their bones in pieces, and chop them up like meat in a kettle, like flesh in a cauldron. So here the leaders of Israel are likened to cannibals with respect to treating their subjects with extreme violence and oppression. So the words in blue are talking about the leaders of Israel, those who hate the good and love the evil. And then the rest of the words, those in green, are the metaphor is that they're cannibals. They're chopping up the people and throwing their bones and skin in a pot and eating them. And so this is a very powerful way of describing the oppression with which the leaders are oppressing the people. The last thing I want to talk about under imagery is personification. So here, the most famous examples of personification are where you get Lady Wisdom and Lady Folly in the first chapters of Proverbs. So chapter 1, wisdom cries out in the street, in the square she raises her voice, at the busiest corner she cries out, at the entrance of the city gate she speaks. And so here, wisdom is a non-human entity that's given human characteristics. So that's what personification is. So she's crying out, she's raising her voice, she's speaking. Likewise, in Proverbs 9, you get folly, or the foolish woman who has human characteristics. She's loud, she's ignorant and knows nothing. She sits at the door, she calls, she says. Personification is used poignantly in Lamentations. So this is the way that Lamentations begins. How lonely sits the city that once was full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. She weeps bitterly in the night with tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers, she has no one to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They have become her enemies. So Jerusalem, the city, is what's being described, but she's being described as like a widow, as a princess. She's sitting, weeping bitterly. She has tears on her cheeks. It refers to her lovers, her friends, and her enemies. So granting human characteristics to a non-human entity is a rich way of describing the situation. Let's move on now to the third category of hallmarks of Hebrew poetry, which is various rhetorical devices. So far we've discussed elevated discourse and imagery, and now we'll discuss various rhetorical devices. And I'm just going to talk about a few rhetorical devices here. There's so many that one could treat, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are particularly interesting, but there's so many more that one could discuss. So oxymoron is an interesting rhetorical feature that sometimes appears in the Bible. So an example is in Jeremiah 22:19. With the burial of a donkey, he, that is King Jehoiakim of Judah, shall be buried, dragged off and thrown out beyond the gates of Jerusalem. So especially if we're reading this quickly, we might say, oh, the burial of a donkey, okay, I don't see the oxymoron there. Oxymoron is basically where you have two items that are either opposite or kind of polar in nature that are juxtaposed in order to create a striking contrast or surprise. So you can see actually from the second half of the verse here that this is an oxymoron, because it says that King Jehoiakim is going to be dragged up and thrown out beyond the gates of Jerusalem, which indicates that donkeys at this time in this culture were not buried. They were just thrown out on the field. And so to say he's going to be buried with the burial of a donkey means he's not going to be buried. Proverbs 25:15 is another example of oxymoron. With patience, a ruler may be persuaded, and a soft tongue can break bones. So it's a very striking image. A soft tongue is a gentle, peaceful image of calmness, and then breaking bones is a violent image. And so it forces you to think, what's going on here? And, you know, if you speak calmly to people, that's a more powerful way of persuading them than if you speak violently to people. But this is a really good way of expressing that. Another rhetorical device sometimes you see is hyperbole, and this is another one where we may not notice it all the time, but Job 37:1, at this also my heart trembles and leaps out of its place. So here Elihu is describing his reaction to a theophany, that is to seeing God and his power. And so my heart leaping out of its place is hyperbolic language. if his heart actually left out of place, he wouldn't be alive anymore. But it's a way of describing the really strong emotion and intense feeling that he was experiencing. Psalm 141:7, like a rock that one breaks apart and shatters on the land, so shall there, that is the wicked's bones, be strewn at the mouth of Sheol. Sheol is the grave, or the netherworld. So the wicked's bones, or after they die, they're buried or placed on the ground or in the ground. But it's hyperbolic. It says they're strewn at the mouth of Sheol, the very mouth of the netherworld. So it's just a very poignant image of the destruction of the wicked. A final rhetorical device that I'd like to discuss before moving on to the next category is sound play, and this is one of my favorite categories personally. Unfortunately, this is not really apparent in English because it's plays on sound, so it has to do with the Hebrew words. But just want to show you a few examples of this because it's really cool, and maybe it gives you some impetus to study Hebrew someday. So you actually get sound play at the beginning of the Bible. Genesis 1:1 starts with sound play. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So in Hebrew, it's Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et ha'aretz. So it's a little hard to see with the vowels, which are the little dots here in Hebrew. But if you're just looking at the bigger letters, the consonants, basically the first three letters of Bereshit in the beginning are exactly the three letters that are in the word created, which is the next word. Genesis 1 is not really poetry, but it's not really prose either. It could be described as poetic prose, somewhere in between. Isaiah 5:7 is a classic location of sound play. So he hoped for mishpat, justice, but behold, mispach, injustice. For tzedakah, equity, but behold, tzedakah, iniquity or outcry. So here you have this reversal of expectation through the use of sound play. So God was expecting good things from the people and the leaders, but what he found was injustice and iniquity. Another example of sound plays in Zephaniah 2. Sound plays all over the minor prophets, especially the book of Micah. But here's an example from Zephaniah. So for Gaza shall be deserted, Azuvah, and Ashkelon shall become a desolation. Ashdod's people shall be driven out at noon, and Ekron shall be uprooted, Te'aker. So here you have the oracle of judgment, the declarations of judgment being strengthened by these similarities of sounds between the names of the places that are going to be destroyed. You get sound play acting to indicate reversal of, just reversal in Isaiah 40, verse 4. And this famous verse handles Messiah. Every valley shall be lifted up, and every mountain and hill be made low. The uneven ground, akov, shall become level, and the rough places a plain, bik'ah. And in Hebrew, the letters B and B are the same letter. It just kind of depends on where in the word it occurs. So akov and bik'ah are a little more similar than they might look at first glance. So the uneven ground, it gets reversed, it gets changed into a plane. And the way they do that is by basically reversing the letters in the word. So pretty cool. All right, let's be done with that and move on to the fourth hallmark of Hebrew poetry, which is concision. So in Hebrew poetry, poetic lines tend to be short and concise. So lines of biblical poetry are generally no longer than 3 or 4 words. So take Proverbs 14:15, for example, kind of random example. So in English, the simple believe everything, but the clever consider their steps. In Hebrew, Peti Ya'amin L'chol Davar Ve'ahum Yabin La'ashuro. So in English and Hebrew, the first line here is 4 words. But in English, the second line is 6 words. In Hebrew, it's just 3 words. So often the lines are really short in Hebrew, and they're longer in translation. Famous poem, perhaps the most famous poem in the Bible, Psalm 23. So we'll just look at the first 4 verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. So I'll read it in Hebrew, and you can look at the word counts for the lines as I do this. Adonai hoi lo echsa, binaot deshe yavitzini, almei menuchot yinahaleni, nafshi yushovev. So you can hear it's kind of short and compact. Parataxis is a term that basically describes the lack of connective words between poetic lines. And so you see this in Psalm 23:1, which we just looked at. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It doesn't say the Lord is my shepherd, therefore I shall not want, or for this reason I shall not want. There's just no connecting particle. Proverbs 11:22, a gold ring and a swine's snout, a woman beautiful and turning from sense. It's an overly literal translation, but most English translations, they flesh this out by saying something like a gold ring and a swine's snout is a beautiful woman who lacks sense. But the Hebrew, it's paratactic, which basically means you have this one image, a gold ring in the nose of a pig, and then you have a beautiful woman who lacks sense, and they're juxtaposed. And then you have to figure out, why are these juxtaposed? What analogy is being drawn between the two? So it's striking. So parataxis makes poetry more intense, since the poet's meaning is expressed in few words, and potentially ambiguous, since the lack of connection between the lines sometimes allows for multiple interpretations. So poetic lines are short. In addition, entire poems tend to be short in the Old Testament. Biblical poems are on average about 30 verses or fewer in length. So again, Psalm 23 is 6 verses long. Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, the valorous woman, the Eshet Chayil, that's 22 verses long. That's a kind of lengthy poem, but it's only 22 verses. The longest poem in the Hebrew Bible is Psalm 119, which has 176 verses. But this length is an exception that proves the rule. That poem is super long for the Old Testament. Most poems are a lot shorter than that. But if you think of other poems that you're familiar with, like Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass comes to mind, for example. I mean, that's a huge poem, or the Iliad or the Odyssey. I mean, those poems are gigantic. But in the Hebrew Bible, poems tend to be pretty short. And books that consist entirely of poetry, like Psalms, Proverbs, Songs, Lamentations, or mostly poetry like Job, they don't actually consist of one long continuous poem each, but rather they consist of a series of shorter poems. For example, the Psalter, each psalm is its own poem. It's not, the whole book is not one poem. Likewise with the book of Job. The book of Job consists of a bunch of speeches from Job and his friends, each one of which is its own poem. There's obviously the whirlwind speech from Yahweh as well. So let's finish up this section with another quote from Robert Alter. In closed forms, such as the one-line Hebrew proverb, the two versets of which continue a kind of couplet. Versets just means like two parallel lines. So basically, in Hebrew poetry, words, syntactic patterns, that is word order, and repeated or varied cadences have a strong tendency to press closely against one another, generating complications of meaning by virtue of the sheer tightness of the frame in which they are held. One prominent effect of such closed forms is an interanimation of words within the couplet. So this is just a very nice way of describing what goes on in a lot of poetry, not just in the Bible. The terseness of Hebrew poetry usually doesn't come across in English translations, though at least a couple recent translations have tried to reflect this feature. So Robert Alter actually spent the last few decades translating the entire Hebrew Bible, and it's a magisterial accomplishment, and it's just come out in this nice 3-volume set, came out in Fasco versions over the years. So I'd recommend taking a look at that. There's also the very literalistic translation by Everett Fox called The 5 Books of Moses. But it can be very enlightening because it can help you see some of the patterns that are going on in Hebrew, particularly the concision. But it's so literal, it can be a little confusing sometimes. All right, a couple more categories to go. So we've talked about elevated discourse, imagery, various rhetorical devices, and concision. Now I want to talk about meter very, very briefly. So I've just put a bunch of question marks here, which is to say that for at least the last 2,000 years, scholars from various cultures and in various places have been trying to figure out whether there is meter in Hebrew poetry in the Bible. And the basic answer is we don't know. If there is, we haven't figured it out, which to my mind indicates pretty clearly that there's not a strict meter. That said, the lines of poetry in the Old Testament tend to fall within certain limits in terms of the number of words, like we saw before. 2 words, 3, 4, 5. They tend not to be much longer than that, and so there are quasi-metrical bounds. But it's more of just a general conception. It's not a strict meter, again, like iambic pentameter. one other thing is, you might wonder, is there rhyme in Hebrew poetry? A lot of English poetry has rhyme. Hebrew poetry doesn't tend to have rhyme. It's way easier to rhyme words in Hebrew because of the endings that they have than it is in English, for example. And so rhyming words in Hebrew is not really a sophisticated thing to do. And in fact, it doesn't usually occur in Hebrew poetry, with some exceptions. Like if you'd not plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have figured out my secret. Samson says it's very rhymed, but that's the exception, not the rule. Okay, that's all I have to say about meter for now. So let's move on to our final category, our final hallmark of Hebrew poetry, which is parallelism. And as I said at the beginning, this is probably the most salient feature of Hebrew poetry. So what is parallelism? Parallelism is similarity or equivalence in word order and or meaning between two adjacent lines of poetry. Similarity or equivalence in word order and or meaning between two adjacent lines of poetry. Let's look at a couple examples where you have adjacent lines of poetry where the meaning is repeated and the word order is repeated. This is rare, this is the exception, but the parallelism here is very clear. Psalm 27:1, the Lord is my light and my help, whom should I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life, whom should I dread? So the blue lines, you can see they're parallel in meaning and in word order, and so are the green lines. And of course, word order differs in English from in Hebrew, but sometimes word order, and perhaps even a lot of the time, can be represented similarly, if not identically, in English as in Hebrew. And so in this example, you can see the word order is the same in English and in Hebrew. Jeremiah 1:5 is another example of this. Before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet concerning the nations. So again, if you look at the blue and then the green, there's repeated meaning and repeated word order. But again, this is not typical. Normally, there's more variation than that in parallel lines of poetry. And as Adele Berlin says, equivalence does not imply identity. The second line of a parallelism rarely repeats exactly the same words or exactly the same thought as the first. It's more likely to echo, expand, or intensify the idea in the first line in any one of a number of ways. So the heading I've included here is parallelism builds, intensifies, and develops. These are my words now. Because parallelism is fundamentally repetition with variation, it's interesting and useful to focus on the variation. That is, what's new or different in the second line. The variation often intensifies the poet's meaning or makes the poet's focus more precise, thus nuancing and fleshing out the poem's message, or the poet's message. And in the case of narrative poems, incrementally developing plot and character. So parallelism is one of the main means by which the Hebrew poets developed their poems and caused them to grow over the course of the poem and deepen in meaning. James Kugel, whom I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, he has generalized parallelism to be A and what's more B. So the first line says one thing A, and then the second line says, and what's more B. This is fine as a generalization. It's not universally descriptive of Hebrew poetry, but there's actually a few examples where you get this kind of thing explicitly, like in Proverbs 19:10. Unfit for the fool is pleasure, even more for a slave to rule princes. So it's an a fortiori argument. If the first thing I'm saying is true, how much more is the second thing true? A and what's more B. Proverbs 15:11. Sheol, the grave, and perdition are before the Lord. How much more so the hearts of men? Sometimes you get the repetition is very clear in a poem. And so we're running a little low on time, so I'm not going to read everything here, but you can just glance at the highlighted words and look at this later if you want to. But you can see the repetition can be very prominent. In Ecclesiastes 3, the strong element of repetition, a time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up what is planted, etc. That contributes really forcefully to the message of the poem, which is about the repetitious and, if you will, meaningless nature of life. Its cyclical nature that seems absurd. Terracing is a term, the term doesn't really matter, but it's a term that people have used to describe a particular kind of repetition where you get the end of one line repeated at the beginning of the next line. So make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth. break forth into joyous song and sing praises to the Lord with the lyre and the sound of melody. And there's another example that I won't read. Looking at techniques like this, not necessarily mind-blowing, it's not going to change your understanding of the poem, but again, my goal in everything I'm saying today is to help us slow down as we're reading, pay attention to the small things that are going on, which helps us appreciate the beauty of these poems more and their meaning. Word pairs are something that's a common way of presenting variation in Hebrew poetry. So word pairs can be synonymous, they can be antonymic, correlative, etc. So synonymous word pairs basically mean more or less the same thing. Here's some examples. For we sink down to the dust, our bodies cling to the ground. Job 28, God understands the way to it, wisdom, and he knows its place. He rebukes the sea and makes it dry, and he dries up all the rivers, in Nahum 1:4. So it's interesting to pay attention to these minor variations in the words that are used. Word pairs can be antonymic, expressing opposites. Isaiah 44, is there any God besides me? There's no other rock, I know not one. In Hebrew, it's a little easier to see because is there is one word and there is no is one word. Job 23:9, on the left, God hides and I cannot behold him. I turn to the right, but I cannot see him. So left and right are antonymic, that's an antonymic word pair. And then I've grayed behold and see, which are a synonymous word. Word pairs can be correlative. I was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. So eyes and feet they're not opposites, but they're corollaries. They're related terms. They're both body parts. May he live while the sun endures and as long as the moon throughout all generations. Sun and moon are both celestial bodies. Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching. So why are word pairs important? Well, they can incrementally move forward a poem and deepen its meaning. One way in which word pairs are sometimes used, especially correlative word pairs, is to create what's called merism. Again, the term doesn't really matter that much, but merism basically means when two correlative words, related words, are used to discuss or to portray a totality, to portray a whole. And the words are often not necessarily opposites, but kind of poles from each other. So here's some examples. The glory of his forest and his fruitful land the Lord will destroy, both soul and body, and it will be as when an invalid wastes away. So both soul and body describes the whole person. God is going to destroy the whole person. Psalm 95:5, the sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed. The sea and the dry land basically means God made everything. Of course, the way that Psalm 95:5 puts it is much more interesting and articulate than God made everything. But that's the basic point. Likewise, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth can be considered a merism for everything. I'm not going to read this at length, but the very famous passage from Joel 2 that's quoted in the book of Acts, then afterward I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. So he's talking about all flesh, everybody, and you get that later on. If you look down, you can see the other term in blue, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And then there's a series of merisms, your sons and your daughters, your old men and your young men, male and female slaves. You get portents in the heavens and on the earth. The sun shall be turned to darkness, the moon to blood. So sometimes when we read accounts like this, we may think, well, you know, what's going on literally? Is it's just sons and daughters or just old men, but not old women and stuff. But no, it's basically these terms are used to talk about everyone. Number parallelism, I just want to take a minute. I know we're running out of time and just have a few minutes left, but I just want to mention this one because number parallelism is something you see in the Bible, and you may say, what exactly is the purpose of this? And actually, it can have different purposes, but it's interesting to look at. So Amos 1, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, and for 4, I will not revoke the punishment, because they've threshed Gilead with threshing sledges of iron. This doesn't mean that Damascus committed only 3 transgressions, or maybe only 4. It just means they committed a lot of transgressions, and saying 3, nay, 4 is a climactic way of expressing that. Another example is in 1 Samuel 18. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Whether those terms are literal or not, the point is, okay, Saul's a good warrior, but David is so much better than Saul. You may be familiar with the examples from Proverbs. There's 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. And then as you can see, there's a list of 7 things. So here, 6 is just a way of setting up 7, saying like, there's 6 things God hates. Actually, you know what? There's 7, and here they are. So it's just a poignant way of saying it. Another number parallelism is found at the end of Proverbs in the words of Agur. And here it works a little differently. 3 things are too wonderful for me. 4 I do not understand. And then you get the way of an eagle in the sky, the way of a snake on the rock, and the way of a ship on the high seas, and the way of a man with a girl. So here it seems that actually it's not so much saying 3 things, no 4, and then here's a list of 4. The 3, no 4 is a way of highlighting the interesting or climactic nature of the 4th, the final element. The attraction of the sexes is perhaps the most mysterious thing that's mentioned here of these mysterious things. And so the number parallelism highlights that. Final example of number parallelism is Genesis 4. If Cain is avenged 7-fold, truly Lamech 77-fold. So Lamech says, okay, Cain murdered Abel, but I killed a man, for a very small slight. I'm going to be avenged incredibly. And this may hopefully bring to mind the verse in the New Testament that Peter came to Jesus and he said, Lord, if another member of the church, if a brother or sister sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. So in our mathematically inclined scientific culture, we tend to see numbers and think, okay, these are literal, they're real numbers. But obviously, Jesus' point here is not to say, well, forgive somebody 77 times, so that, man, if they sin against you a 78th time, that's it. No, he's saying there should be no limit to your forgiveness. You should forgive infinitely. We're basically out of time. So the last couple of things I was going to mention were just chiasm, which is a mirror pattern where you get A, B, B, A, or A, B, C, B, A. Many of you are probably familiar with that term. So I won't read these examples, but this is just another type of parallelism. Just a way, just adducing all these examples to show that there are many kinds of parallelistic techniques that you find in Hebrew poetry, and I've just provided you with a sample of them. So forgive me for just kind of moving through these, but I think we're being recorded today, so if you want to come back and look at the video, or I can send you this presentation, you're welcome to look at these at your leisure. So there's another cool type of parallelism called Janus parallelism, where you have a term that is parallel to a term that precedes it and to a term that follows it. So this is only perceptible in Hebrew, but it's really cool, so I wanted to list it. Again, if you want to talk about this with me later, I'm happy to. So the final thing I want to say in conclusion is, well, in the words of Adele Berlin, because she's put it so well, more than just a set of formal features or structures, poetry is sound and vision compressed for intensity and expressed with potency. Biblical poetry struggles to probe and stretch the important cultural concepts and issues of ancient Israel in exquisitely distilled Hebrew. In that sense, it is the purest, most rarefied expression of biblical thought. Guess I'm happy to end there. Thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was awesome. I felt like I was back at Gordon Conwell again. So we're going to start charging tuition for this. This is that was really super. So we do have a few minutes for some questions. Let's see, Jonathan, do you want to end your sharing of your screen?
Sure, I'm happy to do that.
Great. And I already see a little blue hand that's been raised. And if you have any questions or comments that you would like to make, we'll try and get to as many as we can. And so let's do, Robin, you there?
Jonathan, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. And do you hear us all applauding all over? That was so well organized, comprehensive, concise, clear. All the categories, the beautifully and colorfully laid out to help us read and hear scripture. And Patrick read the Song of Moses even this morning. That was one of the scriptures. So, and we can go back to your talk to understand more. So I just want to thank you so much. I can't imagine how many hours went into that preparation, but I really, really want to thank you. And I'm so glad Zoom worked this morning. So Well done.
Thank you so much, Robin. Really appreciate it. Thanks for asking me to share.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Robin. Betsy?
Here I am. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Jonathan, that was awesome. Thank you so much. And I too am so glad that everything worked this morning, and I'm glad I caught it today. But this poetry is my wheelhouse. So this is like, woohoo, I just love it. And I've been in retreats before where people are asked to write their own psalms. So I think, this is inspiring, like, hey, everybody try and write your own psalm. Use one of those forms. But I'm also glad that I can look at this later and go back to it, which is very wonderful. And I just really, really appreciate it. And just one note on poetry, I'm going to post on the telephone pole in front of my house. It says haiku for you. And then there's a haiku underneath that sign, and then people can put up their own haikus on the telephone pole. So just a little poetry celebration to have on Elliott Street here in Beverly. So you're welcome. Anybody can stop by. So thanks, Jonathan. That was just awesome, awesome, awesome.
Thanks so much, Betsy. That sounds like a great thing to do on Elliott Street.
Yeah.
It makes me want to do my refrigerator poetry, all those little words that you can make poetry out of, but to actually just make a poem based on all of your presentation there, Jonathan. So.
Exactly, yeah.
Thanks, Betsy.
Thank you.
Jack? Let's see, Jack, I can unmute you if you need me to.
Oh, there we go. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Jonathan, this is Jack here. Thanks so much. Outstanding presentation, and look forward to hearing you again sometime down the road. A couple of questions here. One, probably in our culture, the most obvious feature that most people would associate with poetry is rhyme. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the wonderful ride of Paul Revere and so forth. But is it in fact the case that rhyme is not really important for Hebrew poetry, as apparently meter isn't either, or rhythm? So there's that thing. And then I wonder if you had some thoughts about the use of poetry in Christian communication today, whether it's preaching and whatnot. And what's behind my question is evidently poetry was part of Hebrew popular culture. Whereas in our modern culture, I guess, except for rap music, we don't really hear a lot of poetry. It's very esoteric and academic for most people, high poetry. So what about, teaching and preaching? Is there any, takeaway here? Because sometimes our homiletics professors say, use poetry very sparingly in your sermon. Any thoughts on that? But what about the rhyme thing? And then the differences between what might have been Hebrew popular culture and our popular culture.
Thanks, Jack. Those are great questions. Yeah, so first on the rhyme, you're correct that rhyme is not an important aspect of Old Testament poetry. I mentioned offhand the verse in Judges where Samson says, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have discovered my riddle, my secret. So in Hebrew, that's lule charashtem be'eglati lo matzatem chidati. So eglati and chidati, they rhyme. They're at the end of the lines. And charashtem is the word for plow, and then matzatem is the word to find. But the reason those words rhyme is because those are just, it's like two of the identical verb form, and then the others are like my and my are the elements that are rhyming. And so basically the way that gender and number and are expressed grammatically in Hebrew makes it just most words that are feminine, for example, grammatically feminine, end in the same way. And so to rhyme two words that are grammatically feminine is very, very easy. And I guess they just chose not to do that, perhaps because it wasn't as interesting as the other techniques we discussed. in any case, whatever the reason, and of course that's speculative or speculative to say why or why not they may have not used rhyme. But in any case, if you just look at the text, there's not really a lot of rhyme. So no, it's not important, or that important. In terms of the poetry and Christian communication, that's a really interesting question. I think, you know, a lot of the books that I read these days are kids' books, of course, and I've been struck as I've been thinking about Hebrew poetry over the last few years and reading a lot of kids' books that we tend to teach our kids to speak and to read through poetry in our culture today, which is really interesting. And so in that sense, poetry is really, I think, foundational for our culture. On the other hand, as you said, I think there's wisdom to homiletics professors saying use poetry sparingly, because poetry, as you said, it's not really, with some exceptions, like certain styles of music, like hip hop or rap, poetry is not as central to our everyday culture as it's sometimes in history, perhaps. I think in terms of whether, to the degree to which poetry was central to ancient Israelite culture, that I don't know. I think it's kind of speculative, because, I mean, I'd be interested to hear the reasons for that if you've read about it. But as far as I'm aware, you know, the Bible was written largely for the literati, so it's intended to be accessible, but the primary audience consuming it was educated people in ancient Israel. And so for that reason, there's a lot of poetry in the Bible, but that doesn't necessarily imply that people were using poetry in everyday speech a lot back then. So that's an interesting question that I'd need to think about more. Finally, to really address your question is, should we use poetry more in Christian communication? I think there's an aspect, like I said, of wisdom to not using it too much, and because you don't want to turn people off that they're not so used to as the primary means of communication. But I think, as I was saying with those food for thought questions, if a lot of the Bible is written in the form of poetry and in the form of story, I think if we're trying to be true in our preaching and teaching in our devotional life too, to not only the meaning of the text, but the form of the text, I think we need to take seriously that there's so much poetry in the Bible and think about how that can shape our communal communication, just as stories can be a very powerful form from the pulpit as well. So yeah, I'm not a homiletics expert, but I would say with some due caution, I think that's a really good question, and to discuss about how to use poetry more in preaching and just in our communication with each other in the church.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jeff.
Sounds like a part 2 in the fall, Jonathan.
Right, start count on it.
Let's see. I'm seeing one more hand, so let's we do want to move on to coffee hour here pretty soon, but why don't we do this one final question comment, and then we'll go to coffee hour. Nancy?
Hi, I just wanted to thank you. This was so well done, and so easily, you made something very complicated and deep very easy to understand. I really was interested in how, you know, several important stories were told through prose and also through poetry. I thought that was very interesting. I have just 2 quick questions. I also thought it was very interesting that the parallelism is a characteristic of ancient Israel, and how fortunate we are today it is, because we're all, you know, reading the Bible. I'm just curious, my first question is, you said Israel and its neighbors. Who would those neighbors have been? And my second question is, I'm just curious as to why you used the Revised King James to do
this presentation as opposed to some other. And I'm just curious as to the, you know, like what does that translation, how does that bring out your point so well?
Thanks for the words of appreciation, and thanks for the questions. I'll take the second one first. I used the new revised standard version.
Sorry,
NRS. Yeah. I just use that as a matter of convenience because we, at least in maybe the last year or two, have often used that for the readings in church. It's a standard ecumenical translation that's used by many churches and scholars. So yeah, there's nothing about the NRSV in particular that brings out the parallelism or other aspects of Hebrew poetry more than any other translation. In fact, I think if I wanted to recommend a translation to you, it would probably be the Tanakh translation by the Jewish Publication Society. It's often referred to as the NJPS translation, the New Jewish Publication Society translation. It came out in 1985, but it's sometimes you can find it under the name Tanakh, Tanakh, and that's one of the standard Jewish English translations of the Bible used nowadays. There's 2 points that make it really interesting to read. One is it's different enough from most Christian translations that it's defamiliarizing, and it feels kind of like you're reading the text for the first time, so it causes you to slow down, and it's really interesting, and it's a really beautiful translation too. And the second thing is the people who put together that translation were really interested in trying to bring out poetic techniques in it, and so you can sometimes see those aspects more in that translation. So I just use the NRSV, like I said, as a matter of convenience since we've been using it and since it's a standard translation, but there's nothing special about the NRSV with respect to poetry. Regarding your other question about Israel, who were Israel's neighbors? Primarily, there's this city in Syria, what's now Syria. There was a city called Ugarit that basically was a Canaanite center, a port. And we have a bunch of literature from this city in a language that's called, after the name of the city, Ugaritic or Ugaritic. And actually, they worshipped Baal there, and they worshipped the god El. And so anyway, you know, when the Israelites are fighting against the Baal worshippers, like Jezebel in the Bible, it's like the people of Ugarit were, you know, kind of had an affinity for those people who are mentioned in the Bible. So it's Israel's neighbors, as are mentioned in the Bible. And we have a bunch of texts from Ugarit, and a lot of them are written in the form of poetry, and it's highly parallelistic, very much like the poetry in the Hebrew Bible. So I would say primarily in terms of similarity of literature, it's the Ugaritic literature. To some degree, Akkadian literature. Akkadian refers to Assyrian and Babylonian. There's a lot more Akkadian literature that we have. In fact, we have more Akkadian literature attested than we have Latin literature, which is interesting. We have a ton of it.
Wow.
So it's like clay tablets, cuneiform tablets. That Akkadian poetry, like the Gilgamesh epic, for example, that employs parallelism as well, but it's not quite so prominent as it is in Ugaritic literature. So when I said Israelites, the Israelites' neighbors, I had primarily in mind the Canaanites, the people of Ugarit, and the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who are, you know, some of the most prominent neighbors of Israel that are mentioned in the Bible.
Thanks so much.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Jonathan, that was awesome. Thank you very, very much. I think you made something that we might have approached with a little fear and trepidation a lot less fearful and trepidation alike. So thank you. So I'm going to stop the recording at this point.